I was folding his shirts the way I had folded them for 16 years, corners tucked, sleeves crossed, when my fingers brushed against a seam in the suitcase lining that should not have existed. Griffin was in the shower 2 rooms away, humming some tune I did not recognize, getting ready for what he called a routine trip to Denver, and I remember thinking that a man does not hum like that before a boring supplier meeting. I pressed my palm flat against the false bottom of his garment bag, felt the stiff edge of something rectangular hiding beneath the fabric, and by the time I pulled out the thick red envelope and saw the names written across the folded documents inside, my hands had already started shaking before my mind caught up to what I was looking at. I did not scream. I did not cry. I sat down on the edge of our bed with the envelope in my lap, and I listened to the water running in the shower, and I thought about the 14,000 small ways a man can tell you he owns you before you finally understand what he means by it. My name is Odessa Renfrau Voss, and for 16 years I was married to a man who liked to remind me, in that smooth, patient voice he used the way other men used a fist, that it was his money and therefore his rules. I want to tell you how I found out that was a lie, and how a single red envelope hidden in a suitcase lining unraveled a marriage, a business, and a version of myself I had almost forgotten existed. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a house my grandfather built with the profits from a small textile mill that my father, Walton Renfrau, later turned into something much larger. Renfrau Textile Group started as a single warehouse near the Cooper River and became, over 3 decades, one of the largest independent fabric and upholstery manufacturers in the Southeast, supplying furniture companies from Georgia to Virginia. My father was not a flashy man. He wore the same 3 suits on rotation and drove a truck older than most of his employees, but he built something real, and he built it for me because I was his only child and my mother had died when I was 9. I met Griffin Voss when I was 26, at an industry dinner my father had dragged me to because he wanted, in his words, somebody with a modern eye to help him think about expansion. Griffin was 31 then, sharp-suited, magnetic in that specific way certain men are magnetic, the kind of man who could walk into a room of strangers and leave 20 minutes later with 4 new business cards, and the sense that everyone there now considered him an old friend. He was working in commercial real estate finance at the time, and he had opinions about everything, delivered with just enough charm that you forgave him for never asking your opinion in return. I fell for him the way you fall down a flight of stairs, fast and without meaning to and unable to stop once it started. We married 18 months later in the garden of my father's house, under the live oaks, and for the first few years, I believed we were building something together the way my parents had. Griffin left commercial finance and came to work at Renfrau Textile Group as Vice President of Operations, a title my father gave him more out of hope than conviction. When my father died of a heart attack 6 years into our marriage, I inherited 61% of the company outright, with the rest split among distant cousins who had no interest in running anything. Griffin, at the funeral, took my hand and told me he would carry the weight so I would not have to, and at the time, grieving and exhausted, I let him. That was the beginning of the arrangement that would define the next decade of my life. Griffin became CEO. I became, on paper, a majority shareholder who rarely appeared at the office. He told me it looked better for investors and lenders to have a single, consistent public face running the company, someone who could be in New York on Tuesday and Charlotte on Thursday without confusing anyone about who was in charge. I told myself I did not care about being seen. I had never wanted the spotlight the way Griffin did. I wanted the company to survive and grow, and I trusted him to make that happen. Somewhere in that trust, a smaller, quieter transformation was happening, when I did not notice until it had already reshaped our entire marriage. Griffin began managing all our money, not just the company's, but ours personally. He opened accounts I did not have full access to. He set up automatic transfers I did not fully understand. When I asked questions, he answered them with a patience that somehow always left me feeling foolish for asking. "You don't need to worry about this," he would say, refilling my wine glass at dinner as though that settled things. "That's what I'm here for." The phrase he used most, the one that became almost a joke between friends who had heard him say it enough times, was simple. "My money, my rules." He said it about vacations. He said it about the car I drove, always something practical he had chosen, never the convertible I once mentioned liking. He said it about the charity board I wanted to join, which he vetoed because it would take time away from what actually mattered. He said it once, in front of my own cousin at Thanksgiving, when I suggested we redo the kitchen with money from my personal dividend account. He laughed, not unkindly, the way you laugh at a child who has suggested something charmingly impractical, and said, "Sweetheart, it's still my money, my rules, even if your name's on the paperwork somewhere." I laughed along with him that day, because that is what you learn to do. You laugh along, and you go quiet, and you tell yourself that a marriage is made of compromises, and that maybe you are the one being difficult, and maybe love means letting someone else carry the weight even when the weight was never really theirs to carry in the first place. By the time I turned 42, Griffin controlled every account that mattered. My personal dividends from the company were funneled automatically into a joint account he managed. My credit cards had limits he had set. When I wanted to buy my sister a birthday gift that cost more than $300, I found myself, absurdly, asking permission from a man whose entire fortune existed because my father had built something and then died and left it to me. I am telling you all of this so you understand why, on a Tuesday evening in March, when I found a hidden compartment in the lining of my husband's suitcase and pulled out a thick red envelope full of documents with names I did not recognize, something in me did not simply break. Something in me finally, after 16 years, woke up. The suitcase itself was nothing unusual. Griffin traveled constantly for what he called supplier relations, a rotating circuit of cities that always seemed to require him gone 3 or 4 nights a week. I had stopped questioning the travel years earlier, partly because arguing about it never changed anything, and partly, I admit now, because some quiet part of me had grown to prefer the silence of the house when he was gone. That evening, he had asked me, almost as an afterthought, to help him pack for Denver because he was running behind on a call with the Colorado supplier and needed to leave for the airport within the hour. I did what I had done 100 times before. I laid his shirts out on the bed, folded them the way he liked, tucked his shaving kit into the side pocket, checked that his passport was where it belonged even though this was a domestic trip, a habit left over from years of international ones. The garment bag he wanted me to use was an older one, a heavy leather case his father had given him when he graduated college, one he rarely used anymore because he preferred the newer hardshell luggage. But the newer bag was apparently still at the dry cleaner after a spilled drink from his last trip. As I smoothed the bottom lining flat to fit one last folded suit, my palm caught on an edge that should not have been there. A ridge, stiff beneath soft leather, running the width of the bag. I pressed harder and felt what was unmistakably a seam that had been resewn, not by a manufacturer, but by hand recently, the stitching slightly uneven in a way factory work never is. I should tell you that in that moment, I almost stopped myself. Some old, obedient part of me, the part trained over 16 years to not ask questions about Griffin's business, whispered that this was not my concern, that a hidden compartment in an old suitcase probably held nothing more interesting than a spare set of cufflinks or an old photograph he was embarrassed about. But my fingers had already found the small tab at the corner, disguised as a decorative leather pull, and before I fully decided to do it, I had already unzipped the false bottom and lifted the panel free. Inside lay a thick red envelope, the kind used for important documents, sealed with a metal clasp rather than glue, along with a slim stack of items beneath it. A second cell phone, powered off. A folded photograph. A small velvet box I did not open right away because my hands had gone still around the envelope itself. I opened the clasp and slid the papers out onto the bed, and the first thing I saw was a name that was not mine, printed at the top of a wire transfer authorization form, a name I had never heard in 16 years of marriage, Priscilla Duvernay. The transfer was for $18,000, dated 3 weeks earlier, drawn from an account I did not recognize, an account with a routing number that, when I would later trace it, belonged to a bank in Nashville, Tennessee, 400 miles from anywhere Griffin claimed to travel for supplier relations. Beneath that document sat another, and another, a stack of nearly 20 wire authorizations spanning almost 3Y. Years, all bearing the same name, all drawn from an account labeled only by a number. No name attached that I recognized, totaling, as I would add up later with trembling hands and a calculator app on my phone, just over $640,000. Beneath the wire transfers was a lease agreement, a 2-bedroom townhome in a neighborhood called Green Hills in Nashville, signed 11 months earlier under the name Griffin W. Voss, co-signed by Priscilla Duvernay. And beneath that, folded separately, was a birth certificate. A little girl, 8 months old, last name Voss, father listed as Griffin Walton Voss, mother listed as Priscilla Ann Duvernay. I sat on the edge of our bed. In the house my husband had insisted we buy in his name first because it was cleaner for the mortgage, holding proof that somewhere in Nashville, Tennessee, my husband had a child I had never heard of, with a woman I had never met, funded by $640,000 that had come from somewhere. And I understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that whatever account that money had come from, it had not come from nothing. Money like that came from somewhere specific, and I intended to find out exactly where. The shower shut off down the hall. I heard the faucet in the sink turn on, the sound of Griffin humming again, unbothered, unaware, a man getting ready to fly to a city where, I now understood, an entirely separate life was waiting for him with a woman who did not know she was the second act of somebody else's marriage. I did not confront him that night. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the dramatic scene, the papers thrown across the room, the shouting. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter and, I think, far more dangerous for Griffin than shouting would have been. I photographed every document with my phone, page by page, careful to capture the account numbers, the dates, the signatures. Then I slid everything back into the red envelope exactly as I had found it, resealed the false bottom of the suitcase, and finished packing his shirts as though nothing in the world had changed. When Griffin came out of the bathroom in his travel clothes, still humming, he kissed my forehead the way he always did, told me he would call when he landed, and asked if I had remembered to pack his good watch. I told him it was in the side pocket where he always kept it. He never checked the bottom of the bag. He never needed to. He had trusted that compartment for years, apparently, without a single reason to think I would ever find it. I stood at the front window of our house and watched his car pull out of the driveway, taillights fading down the tree-lined street, and only once the sound of the engine had disappeared completely did I pick up my phone and call the one person I knew would not tell me to calm down. Desmond Whitfield had been my father's attorney before he became mine, a tall, unhurried man in his 60s who had drafted the trust that held my father's shares in Renfrew Textile Group and who had warned me, gently, at my wedding reception 16 years earlier, that he hoped I had a prenuptial agreement drawn up properly because he had seen too many good companies lost to bad marriages. I had a prenup. My father had insisted, over Griffin's mild protests, that certain assets remain protected. At the time I had thought my father was being overly cautious. That night, sitting alone in my kitchen with a red envelope's worth of photographs saved to my phone, I thanked God, silently and fervently, for his caution. "Desmond," I said when he picked up on the second ring, "I need you to come to the house, tonight if you can." "Odessa," he said, his voice sharpening the way it did when he sensed something was wrong. "What happened?" "I found something in Griffin's suitcase," I said. "I think my husband has been stealing from the company, and I think he has a family I didn't know about." There was a silence on the line long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Desmond said, in the same measured tone he used for everything, "I'll be there in 40 minutes. Don't call the bank yet. Don't confront him over the phone. Just wait for me." I did not wait quietly. In the 40 minutes before Desmond arrived, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, the same kind my father used to keep in his truck, and I wrote down every strange absence, every late-night call taken in another room, every business trip to a city that, I now realized, always seemed to be somewhere within a few hours of Nashville. Every time Griffin had told me not to worry about the finances because he had it handled. He had it handled. I understood now exactly what that meant. When Desmond arrived, I laid the photographs out on the table, one by one, the way Griffin himself might have laid out a presentation for investors. Desmond put on his glasses and studied each one. Without speaking, occasionally making a small note on a legal pad of his own. "This account," he finally said, tapping the wire transfer form. "Do you recognize the routing number?" "No," I said, "but I recognize the amount. $640,000 over 3 years. That's not pocket money, Desmond. That's not a man skimming a little off the top for a hotel room. That's a second household." Desmond removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture I had seen him make only twice before in 16 years, both times before delivering news he knew I did not want to hear. "Odessa," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Does Griffin have signing authority on any Renfrew Textile Group accounts that require dual approval?" I nodded slowly. "The operating accounts require his signature and mine, or his signature and the CFO's, for anything over $100,000. That's been the policy since my father set it up." "And has your signature appeared on any large transfers in the last 3 years that you don't remember approving?" I thought about it, and the honest answer unsettled me more than I expected. "I don't review every document that crosses that account," I admitted. "Griffin handles the day-to-day. I sign what our CFO sends over in batches, sometimes without reading every line because I trust the finance team." "Then that," Desmond said quietly, "is exactly where I would start looking. Because a man who builds a second household on $640,000 over 3 years is not pulling that from a personal checking account, Odessa. Men like that rarely have the discipline to save it. They borrow it from somewhere they think no one is watching." I felt something cold settle into my chest, a feeling I would come to recognize over the following weeks as the specific, clarifying cold of betrayal, fully understood rather than merely suspected. "You think he's been stealing from the company?" "I think," Desmond said carefully, "that we need forensic accountants inside those books before Griffin lands in Denver and has any reason to suspect you know something is wrong. And I think, given what you've shown me tonight, you need to consider exercising your authority as majority shareholder sooner rather than later." I sat back in my chair and looked at the photographs spread across the kitchen table, at the birth certificate of a child who shared my husband's last name and my complete absence of knowledge. And I thought about 16 years of being told, in 100 different quiet ways, that the money was his and the rules were his and my job was simply to trust him. "Freeze the operating accounts that require my authority," I said, "effective immediately, and get the forensic accountants in first thing tomorrow morning before he's back from Denver." Desmond studied me for a long moment. "You understand what this will trigger. If there's a pattern of misappropriation and we freeze his access without warning, he's going to know something happened the moment he tries to book a hotel or use a corporate card." "Good," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "Let him find out the same way I found out, without warning." Griffin called from the Denver airport that night, his voice light and unconcerned, telling me the flight had been smooth and the supplier dinner was set for the next evening. I told him I loved him and hoped he slept well, and I did not mention the red envelope, and I hung up the phone and looked at Desmond across the table and felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like I was finally in control of my own life. The next morning, at 7 a.m., before Griffin's first meeting in Denver had even begun, Desmond filed the paperwork to suspend Griffin's independent signing authority on all Renfrew Textile Group accounts. Citing shareholder prerogative under the bylaws my father had written decades earlier specifically for situations, he had once told me half-jokingly, where the man running things stops being trustworthy. At the time, I had thought my father was simply being thorough. Now I understood he had been protecting me from a future he could somehow sense, even if he never lived to see it arrive. By 9 a.m., a forensic accounting team Desmond had used before, out of Atlanta, had begun reviewing 3 years of Renfrew Textile Group financial records under a confidentiality agreement that named no one outside the room. By 11 a.m., our CFO, a careful, soft-spoken woman named Marisol Andrade, who had worked for my father before Griffin ever set foot in the building, sat across from me in my father's old office, the one Griffin had converted into a modern glass-walled space he rarely used because he preferred working from the executive suite downtown, and told me something that made the cold in my chest spread further. "There's a vendor account, M. Marisol said, sliding a folder across the desk. Colfax Logistics Consulting. It's been on the books for almost 4 years, invoiced monthly for what's labeled as supply chain optimization services. I flagged it 18 months ago because I couldn't find a contract on file, but Mr. Voss told me it was a legacy arrangement from before I started, personally handled, nothing to worry about. How much has gone to this vendor? I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer would be close to the number burned into my memory from the night before. Just over $600,000, Marisol said. Paid out in irregular increments, never quite large enough to trigger a second signature requirement on their own, but adding up over time to a significant total. I closed my eyes for a moment. Colfax Logistics Consulting. A fictional company, I would learn within the week, registered to an address in Nashville that turned out to be a small UPS store mailbox, funneling company money through fake invoices directly into an account that fed, eventually, into wire transfers made out to Priscilla Duvernay. He built an entire company, I said quietly, just to steal from mine. Marisol did not answer, because there was nothing to say that would soften what the numbers already made clear. Griffin called that afternoon, his voice tight in a way I had learned over 16 years meant something had gone wrong. "Odessa," he said, "my corporate card was declined at the hotel, and I can't access the operating dashboard. What's going on?" I sat at my father's old desk, in my father's old chair, and I felt something settle inside me that I can only describe as the opposite of panic. "I found the compartment in your suitcase, Griffin," I said. "The one with the red envelope." The silence on the line stretched long enough that I could hear, faintly, the ambient noise of a hotel lobby behind him. A bellhop's cart, someone laughing near a fountain, an entire ordinary world continuing on without any idea that the man standing in the middle of it had just been caught. "Odessa," he finally said, his voice dropping into a register I recognized as the one he used when he was managing a difficult investor, calm, reasonable, designed to make the other person feel like the unreasonable one. "Whatever you think you found, I can explain." "Her name is Priscilla," I said. "Your daughter is 8 months old. You've sent her mother $640,000 through a fake consulting company you invented specifically to steal from my father's business. What exactly is the explanation for that?" Another silence, shorter this time, and when he spoke again, the reasonable tone had cracked slightly at the edges. "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," I said. "I've seen the lease, Griffin. I've seen the birth certificate. I've seen 3 years of wire transfers. There is no version of this where you explain your way out of documents." "You can't just freeze the accounts," he said, and there it was, the same instinct I had watched Jake Carter demonstrate in stories like mine before, the pivot away from the betrayal itself and directly toward outrage at the consequences. "There are obligations. Vendor payments due Friday, payroll processing. I need access to run this company." "You don't run this company," I said, and I was surprised by how calm the words felt leaving my mouth, as though I had been rehearsing them my entire marriage without knowing it. "You never did, Griffin. You ran the version of it I let you believe you owned. That ends today." "Odessa, please just don't do anything rash. Let's talk about this like adults when I get home." "You built a second household with money you stole from my father's company," I said. "You are not in a position to talk to me about acting rashly." I ended the call. My hands, I noticed, were no longer shaking. Somewhere between the suitcase lining and that phone call, the shaking had simply stopped, replaced by something harder and far more useful. Griffin flew home the next morning instead of finishing his scheduled trip, and I want to tell you honestly that some small, exhausted part of me expected the version of events I had heard about in other women's stories, the tearful confrontation on the porch, a man begging through a locked door. What I got instead, when Griffin walked through the front door of the house we had shared for 16 years, was something closer to fury than grief. "You had no right," he said, standing in the foyer, still in his travel clothes, his tie loosened, his voice too loud for the quiet house, "to freeze those accounts without talking to me first. Do you understand what you've done? I have relationships with those vendors. I have a reputation." "You have a mistress and a daughter in Nashville," I said, standing my ground in the kitchen doorway. "Funded by money you stole from my father's company. That is what you have, Griffin, not a reputation, a crime. It's not stealing, he said, and I watched something flicker across his face, a kind of desperate recalculation, the same instinct that had probably talked his way through every difficult negotiation of his career, now trying and failing to find an angle. The company owes me for years of running it while you sat back and collected dividends. I built relationships, I closed deals, I kept that place afloat through 2 recessions while you were, what exactly, Odessa? Attending garden club luncheons. The old Odessa, the one who had spent 16 years absorbing comments like that without pushing back, might have flinched. This version of me, standing in her own kitchen with a red envelope's worth of evidence sitting in a locked drawer at her attorney's office, did not flinch at all. My father built that company from a single warehouse, I said. I inherited it because he trusted me with it, not you. You were given a title and a salary and access to accounts that were never actually yours, and instead of running the business honestly, you invented a fake consulting firm and used it to pay for a life you were hiding from me. That's not building relationships, Griffin. That's fraud. His jaw tightened, and for just a moment, I saw the calculation sharpen into something closer to a threat. You can't prove any of that without dragging your own name through it. My name is on that company's public filings. Investors know me. If you try to push me out, you tank the stock price, you tank the supplier confidence, you tank everything your father built, right along with me. Then I'll rebuild it, I said, the way he did. From nothing, if I have to, but I will not spend another day pretending the last 3 years didn't happen just to protect your reputation. That evening, the forensic accounting team confirmed what Marisol had already suspected, that the fraudulent invoices from Colfax Logistics Consulting had been authorized using a digital signature stamp Griffin had access to as CEO. A stamp meant only for routine, pre-approved recurring vendor payments under $50,000. Structured deliberately, transfer by transfer, to stay just beneath the threshold that would have required my direct signature or Marisol's secondary approval. It was not one impulsive theft. It was a system, built patiently over 3 years, the same patience Griffin had once used to court investors and charm my father into trusting him with everything, now revealed as the same skill turned toward robbing us both. The board of Renfrew Textile Group, 6 members including 2 cousins who held minority shares and had, until that week, considered Griffin an asset rather than a liability, convened an emergency meeting 72 hours after I found the envelope. Griffin attended by video from the office downtown, his security badge already deactivated by then, forced to sign in as a guest to even access the conference room where he had once presided over every meeting like a man born to the role. The evidence Desmond and the forensic team presented took less than 20 minutes to lay out. Wire transfers, fake invoices, a shell vendor traced to a Nashville mailbox, a lease agreement, a birth certificate. No one in that meeting asked about the affair itself. Infidelity, painful as it was to me personally, was not a matter for a corporate board. What mattered to them, the way it had mattered to the board in every story like mine I had ever heard, was that the man they had trusted to run the company had been quietly defrauding it for years while using its resources to fund a hidden life. Mr. Voss, the board chair, a steady older woman named Constance Whitmore who had served on the board since my father's earliest years, said carefully, "Do you dispute the authenticity of these documents?" Griffin's face on the video screen had gone the color of old paper. "There's context missing," he said. "This is being taken out of proportion." $640,000 in fraudulent vendor payments over 3 years is not a matter of proportion, Constance replied. It is either accurate or it is not. Which is it? He did not answer. His silence answered for him. The board voted unanimously to terminate Griffin as Chief Executive Officer for cause, effective immediately, revoke all unvested equity compensation under the terms of his original employment agreement, and refer the fraudulent transfers to outside counsel for both civil recovery and potential criminal referral. His executive access, already suspended, was formally and permanently revoked. His name would be removed from all company materials pending the outcome of the investigation. I did not feel triumphant watching it happen. I felt, mostly, exhausted, the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent 16 years being told her instincts did not matter, finally proven right in the worst possible way. In weeks that followed, I learned more about Priscilla Duvernay than I ever expected to know. She was 29, a former marketing coordinator Griffin had met through a supplier conference in Nashville nearly 4 years earlier. When investigators eventually reached her, gently through an intermediary rather than directly, she told a story I recognized immediately, because it was, in its outline, the same story I had lived for 16 years, just compressed into a shorter and even crueler timeline. Griffin had told her he was divorced. He had shown her paperwork, later discovered to be forged, claiming a finalized separation from a marriage that in reality was still very much intact. He had told her the money came from consulting work he did on the side, nothing to do with any company she might have heard of. She had believed him, the way I had once believed him, because he was, above almost anything else, a man who was extremely good at being believed. I did not hate her. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the other woman to become the villain of a story like this, and Priscilla Duvernay was not a villain. She was another person standing in wreckage she had not built, holding a baby who deserved better than the lie both of us had been handed by the same man. I never spoke to her directly. There seemed to be no version of that conversation that would help either of us. But I made sure, through Desmond, that whatever civil recovery the company pursued against Griffin personally would not touch the child support arrangements a family court in Tennessee would eventually establish. Some things, I decided, should not become collateral damage in a war that was never the baby's fault to inherit. The divorce itself took nearly 8 months. Because of the prenuptial agreement my father had insisted on, and because the forensic evidence made clear that Griffin had actively defrauded a company I owned rather than simply mismanaged shared marital funds, the financial settlement leaned overwhelmingly in my favor. Griffin walked away with a modest personal account, the older suitcase, and a legal record that ensured he would likely never again be trusted with executive authority at any company that checked references properly. I remember the last conversation we had in person, on the porch of the house I kept in the divorce, 3 months after that Tuesday evening with the shirts and the seam that should not have existed. He looked smaller than I remembered him, the confidence that had once filled every room he entered now visibly drained out of him, replaced by something tired and unfamiliar. "I lost everything," he said. "No," I said. "You lost the illusion that any of it was ever yours to begin with. It was my father's money, Griffin, my father's company, my family's trust. You were given the privilege of running it honestly, and you chose not to." "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time in 16 years, I believed that some small part of him actually meant it, even if I no longer had any use for his apology. "I believe you're sorry," I said. "But sorry doesn't rebuild what you stole. Sorry doesn't undo 3 years of forged invoices. It's just a word, Griffin, and I've learned that words were always the thing you were best at." He did not argue. He nodded, the way a man nods when he finally understands there is nothing left to negotiate, and he walked back to his car, and I closed the door, and I did not watch him drive away. Marisol Andrade, our loyal CFO, agreed to step into the interim CEO role while the board conducted a formal search. And within 4 months, with the forensic investigation complete and the fraudulent Colfax logistics account fully unwound, Renfrow Textile Group had not only stabilized but had begun, for the first time in years, operating with a transparency it had quietly lost somewhere during Griffin's tenure. I took a more active role than I ever had before, not as CEO, a title I ultimately declined the same way I suspect other women in my position have declined it, but as executive chair, finally showing up in the building my father had built, finally letting employees who had worked there for decades put a face to the name on the ownership documents. An older warehouse supervisor named Otis Prout, who had worked for my father since before I was born, stopped me in the hallway during one of my first full weeks back in the office and said something I have thought about often since. "Your daddy used to say the quiet owner is still the owner, Miss Odessa. Glad to finally see you walking these floors again." I found the red envelope itself, the original one, months later, still sitting in an evidence folder at Desmond's office, waiting for the civil case to formally close. I asked to see it one more time before it was filed away for good, and I sat in his office and looked at the documents that had changed the entire direction of my life, the why. Ray transfers, the lease, the birth certificate, the small velvet box that had turned out to contain, absurdly, a set of cufflinks engraved with a date that meant nothing to me, and, I assume, everything to someone else. I thought about the years I had spent believing the money was his and the rules were his, and I thought about how strange it was that the truth had been hiding, quite literally, inside a false bottom the entire time. A compartment built by a man who thought he was clever enough to keep two lives running side by side forever. Never once considering that the woman folding his shirts might one day press her palm flat against a seam that did not belong. People sometimes ask me whether I regret not confronting him the moment I found the envelope, whether the quiet, methodical route Desmond and I took, freezing the accounts, gathering the forensic evidence, letting the board see the truth for themselves, cost me something I could have gotten faster through anger. I do not think it did. I think anger would have given Griffin exactly what he was best at using: a chaotic, emotional scene he could later reframe as his wife overreacting, rather than the clean, undeniable weight of documents that spoke for themselves. I did not win because Griffin lost everything. I won because I finally understood, sitting on the edge of my own bed with a stolen fortune's worth of secrets in my lap, that the rules had never actually belonged to him at all. They belonged to whoever was willing to stop being afraid of the truth. And on that particular Tuesday evening, folding shirts I would never fold again, I finally became that person. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were the one standing at that suitcase, feeling that seam beneath your fingers? Would you have confronted him immediately, or would you have done what I did and let the silence build the case for you? Share your perspective in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about betrayal, justice, and women who finally learn the difference between being needed and being valued, please consider subscribing and joining us for the next story.